The music satisfied stopped. Carson raised his hand. And Bette Davis began to say what she had never told anyone in 30 years. The band fell silent. Ed McMahon froze mid-laugh. And somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered into his headset, "What the hell is happening?" But Johnny Carson knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it in her eyes the moment she walked onto that stage. Behind the legend, behind the Hollywood armor, behind those famous piercing eyes, there was something breaking. This is the story of the night television stopped being entertainment and became something far more human. How did we get here? Let's go back to the beginning of that evening. It was October 1983. The Tonight Show was running like clockwork, as it had for over 2 decades. The set was immaculate. The iconic wooden desk polished to perfection, the multicolored curtain hanging like a promise of glamour, Doc Severinsen's band warming up with their usual brassy confidence. Johnny Carson arrived at NBC Burbank 3 hours before taping, as always. His ritual was sacred: review the cue cards, check the guest list, make notes in the margins with his favorite fountain pen. Tonight's lineup was solid: a comedian, a young actor promoting a film, and the legendary Bette Davis. Davis was 75 years old. 4 Oscars to her name. A career spanning 5 decades. She had survived Hollywood's golden age, its collapse, and its reinvention. She had battled studios, directors, and co-stars. She had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her rivals. But what Carson didn't know, what no one in that studio knew, was that Bette Davis was carrying something heavier than all those years combined. The show began at 11:30 p.m. sharp. Carson delivered his monologue with surgical precision: 3 political jokes, 2 observational bits, a self-deprecating closer. The audience laughed on cue. Ed McMahon's famous "Here's Johnny!" still echoed in the rafters. The first guest came and went. The young actor was nervous but charming. Carson guided him through the interview with the ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. Then came the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ed McMahon announced, his voice carrying that trademark warmth, "please welcome the incomparable, the legendary Miss Bette Davis." The applause was thunderous. The band launched into an upbeat number. And from behind that famous curtain emerged a woman who had defined American cinema. But something was different. Carson noticed it immediately. The way she walked, slower than usual. The way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her dress. The way those legendary eyes, usually fierce and commanding, seemed to carry an ocean of something unspoken. She sat down across from Carson. The applause died. The lights seemed to dim, though no one had touched the board. "Bet," Carson said, his voice warm. "It's wonderful to have you back." "Johnny," she replied, and there was a crack in her voice that made the entire studio lean forward. "I almost didn't come tonight." Carson's instincts fired. 21 years behind that desk had taught him to read people like books. He knew when a guest was nervous. He knew when they were promoting something. And he knew instantly, when someone was about to break. "Well," he said carefully, setting down his pen, "I'm glad you did." What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. Davis looked at Carson. Then she looked at the camera. Then she looked at the audience. Those hundreds of faces staring back at her from the darkness. "I've spent 50 years pretending," she said. "Pretending to be strong. Pretending nothing could hurt me. Pretending that Bette Davis was made of steel." The studio fell absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of attention, the profound silence of collective breath-holding. "But I'm not made of steel, Johnny. None of us are." Carson didn't interrupt. He didn't reach for a joke. He simply listened. Something he had learned was often more powerful than any question. Davis continued. 3 months ago, I lost someone. Someone I never talked about publicly. Someone Hollywood didn't even know existed. She paused. Her hands, those expressive hands that had gesticulated through 100 films, now lay still in her lap. My daughter. My firstborn. Ruth Elizabeth. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The name hung in the air like smoke. Ruth Elizabeth. The daughter Bette Davis had with her first husband, Harmon Oscar Nelson. The daughter who had lived in the shadow of a legend. The daughter who had struggled, suffered, and ultimately been estranged from her famous mother for nearly a decade. Carson leaned forward slightly. His eyes never left Davis. In the control room, the producer was gesturing wildly. They were running long. The segment was supposed to be 7 minutes. They were already at 12. But Carson ignored every signal. We hadn't spoken in 8 years, Davis said, her voice barely above a whisper now. 8 years, Johnny. Do you know how many days that is? How many chances I had to pick up the phone? How many times I almost did, but my pride, my stupid Hollywood pride, stopped me? She reached into her purse and pulled out something small. A photograph. Worn at the edges, creased from years of handling. This is the last picture we took together. Christmas, 1974. She was smiling. I was smiling. And neither of us knew it would be the last time. Carson did something then that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up. Not to signal a commercial break. Not to introduce another guest. He simply stood, walked around his desk, and sat down in the chair next to Bette Davis. Backstage, producers exchanged panicked glances. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't protocol. Johnny Carson never left his desk mid-interview. Never. But Carson wasn't thinking about protocol. He was thinking about the woman beside him, this titan of cinema who had suddenly become simply a mother grieving a daughter she never got to reconcile with. Bet, he said quietly, and the microphone barely picked it up. Tell me about her. Davis looked at him. For a moment, the legend cracked completely, and what remained was just a 75-year-old woman holding a photograph of a daughter she would never see again. She loved music, Davis said. Not my kind of music. She hated old Hollywood songs. She loved rock and roll. The Beatles. She used to play them so loud it drove me crazy. A small laugh escaped her, fragile, almost painful. And she loved the ocean. When she was a little girl, I would take her to Santa Monica, and she would run into the waves like she was fearless. Like nothing in the world could hurt her. The audience was absolutely still. Some were crying openly. Others stared at their hands, perhaps thinking of their own estranged children, their own unmade phone calls. I was so busy being Bette Davis, she continued, that I forgot to be her mother. I was so busy fighting studios and directors and the whole damn industry that I forgot to fight for her. Carson reached over and took her hand. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to the cameras, but it meant everything. 3 months ago, Davis said, I got a call. Ruth had been sick. Cancer. And she was gone before I even knew she was dying. The word hung there. Gone. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to say I'm sorry. I never got to tell her that despite everything, despite all the years of silence, she was the greatest role I ever played. Being her mother. Even when I failed at it. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Carson turned to the camera. His face was composed, but his eyes glistened in the studio lights. We're going to take a break, he said. But not yet. He looked at the band. At Doc Severinsen, who understood immediately and lowered his trumpet. At Ed McMahon, whose famous jovial face was now solemn with respect. Then Carson turned back to Davis. Bet I've interviewed presidents and kings. I've talked to astronauts who walked on the moon. But I've never heard anything braver than what you just did. Davis shook her head. It's not brave, Johnny. Brave would have been picking up the phone 8 years ago. Maybe, Carson said. But brave is also standing here, in front of millions of people, and telling the truth. That takes something most people never find. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, old-fashioned, monogrammed with his initials. He handed it to her without ceremony. "You know," he said, "when I started this show, I thought my job was to make people laugh. And it is. But somewhere along the way, I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just listen. Just be there. Just remind someone that they're not alone." Davis dabbed her eyes with the handkerchief. The photograph of Ruth still sat in her lap, that frozen moment of Christmas 1974. She would have hated this, Davis said suddenly, and a real smile crossed her face. She would have said, "Mother, you're being dramatic again." Carson laughed, a genuine, warm laugh. "Well, you are Bette Davis." "I am," she said. "For better or worse." The tension in the studio shifted. Something had released. The profound grief was still there, but it had been witnessed, acknowledged, shared. It was no longer Davis's burden alone. Carson stood and walked back to his desk. He picked up the cue cards, glanced at them, then set them aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the camera, "we'll be right back." But before the commercial break, something unexpected happened. The audience rose to their feet. Not to applaud a performance. Not to celebrate a punchline. They stood in silence, a standing ovation without applause, a tribute of presence rather than sound. Davis looked out at them, at these strangers who had just witnessed her most vulnerable moment, and she nodded. Just once. A queen acknowledging her subjects one final time. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. When the show resumed after the break, the atmosphere had transformed. The remaining segment was gentle, almost tender. Carson asked Davis about her early career, about her favorite roles, about the Hollywood she remembered. But everyone knew the real interview had already happened. After the taping ended, Carson walked Davis to her car personally. The photograph of Ruth was still in her hand. "Thank you, Johnny," she said, "for not cutting away. For letting me say what I needed to say." Carson shook his head. "Thank you for trusting me with it." He watched her car disappear into the Burbank night, then stood alone in the parking lot for a long moment. The fountain pen was still in his pocket. The cue cards were still on his desk. The show would air in a few hours, and millions would see what had happened. But for now, there was just the quiet. And the weight of what he had witnessed. Years later, after Carson retired in 1992, he would occasionally speak about that night in private conversations. He never exploited it, never turned it into an anecdote for talk shows. It was sacred to him. "Television can do a lot of things," he once told a young David Letterman. "It can make people laugh. It can sell them things they don't need. It can distract them from their lives. But every once in a while, if you're lucky, it can remind them that they're human. That we're all human. And that's worth more than any rating." Bette Davis passed away in 1989, 6 years after that night. In her final years, she often spoke about the interview, about how Carson had given her permission to be vulnerable, to be more than the legend. The photograph of Ruth traveled with her until the end. It was found in her personal effects, still worn at the edges, still creased from decades of handling. Some moments define a career. Some moments define a medium. And some moments, rare, precious, unrepeatable, define what it means to be human. That night on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson reminded America of something it desperately needed to remember, that behind every legend is a person, behind every performance is pain, and behind every silence is a story waiting to be told. The handkerchief he gave Bette Davis? She kept it. When her estate was settled after her death, it was found in a small box alongside the photograph of Ruth and a single, handwritten note. "To Johnny, thank you for seeing me. Not Bette Davis. Just me. B." And somewhere in the archives of NBC, the tape of that night still exists. Producers have said that when they watch it, even decades later, the silence still feels alive. The grief still feels fresh. And Johnny Carson's simple act of walking around his desk still feels like the bravest thing ever done on late-night television. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't tell a joke. It's hold someone's hand. And let them know they're not alone. That night, Johnny Carson didn't host a show. He held a space. And television was never quite the same.